Widow received anonymous flowers every week for years. When she finally learned who sent them, she couldn't believe it. Margaret Hayes stood at her kitchen window watching the dawn break over the quiet street of Maple Grove. At 63 years old, her hair had turned silver, but her green eyes still held the same warmth they had 40 years ago. Every Sunday morning she followed the same ritual. Coffee, toast, and waiting. The doorbell would ring at exactly 8:47 a.m. It had been that way for 7 years now. 7 years since Thomas died. 7 years of anonymous flowers arriving at her doorstep every single week without fail. The doorbell rang. Margaret walked slowly to the front door, her heart doing that familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with confusion. She opened the door to find a simple bouquet of white lilies and purple irises wrapped in brown paper sitting on her doormat. No card. No name. Just flowers. She picked them up, inhaling their delicate fragrance, and felt the familiar ache in her chest. "Who are you?" she whispered to the empty street. She carried them inside and placed them in her favorite crystal vase, the one Thomas had given her on their 25th anniversary. The morning light caught the facets, casting tiny rainbows across the kitchen table. It started 3 weeks after Thomas's funeral. Margaret had been drowning in grief, barely able to get out of bed. The house felt too empty, too quiet, without Thomas's terrible singing in the shower or his habit of leaving coffee cups on every surface. Their children Sarah and Michael had returned to their own lives in different cities, calling every few days, but ultimately she was alone. That first Sunday morning she heard the doorbell and assumed it was a neighbor checking on her. But when she opened the door, there was no one there. Just a bouquet of daisies, Thomas's favorites, sitting on the welcome mat. She looked up and down the street but saw no delivery truck, no person walking away. Margaret brought the flowers inside and found herself crying for the first time in days. Not the heavy sobs that had racked her body at the funeral, but gentle tears of something that felt almost like gratitude. Someone was thinking of her. Someone cared. The next Sunday it happened again. Different flowers this time. Roses and baby's breath. Again no card. Again no explanation. Margaret called the local florist shops, but none of them had any record of a delivery to her address. She checked with neighbors. No one had seen anything. By the 4th week, Margaret realized this was going to continue. And strangely, she found herself looking forward to Sundays. The flowers became a bright spot in her gray world. A mystery that gave her something to think about besides her grief. Now 7 years later, the flowers still came. Margaret had stopped trying to solve the mystery years ago. She had accepted it as one of life's small, unexplainable gifts. But lately something had changed. She found herself thinking about the sender more and more. Wondering. Needing to know. Margaret sat at her kitchen table sipping her coffee and staring at the fresh bouquet. 7 years. 364 bouquets. Whoever was doing this had spent thousands of dollars. Had dedicated every single Sunday for 7 years to making sure she received flowers. This wasn't a casual gesture. This was devotion. She picked up her phone and called her daughter Sarah. The phone rang 3 times before Sarah answered, sounding slightly out of breath. "Mom, everything okay?" Sarah asked. Margaret smiled. "Everything's fine, honey. I just got my flowers again." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mom, you need to find out who's sending those. It's been 7 years. This isn't normal." "I know," Margaret said quietly. "I think I'm finally ready to find out." After hanging up with Sarah, Margaret made a decision. This Sunday she would wait outside. She would hide and watch. She would finally see who had been leaving these flowers week after week, year after year. The next 6 days passed slowly. Margaret found herself distracted, constantly checking the clock. She told her weekly bridge club that she couldn't make it this Saturday. She wanted to be well rested for Sunday morning. Saturday night, Margaret barely slept. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the possibilities. Was it one of Thomas's old friends from the hospital where he'd worked as a surgeon? Was it a former patient whose life he'd saved? Was it a family member she'd lost touch with? Or the thought that made her heart race, was it someone who had feelings for her? The idea seemed absurd. She was 63. Who would court a widow with anonymous flowers for 7 years without ever revealing themselves? Sunday morning arrived. Margaret was awake before dawn. She dressed in dark clothes and made herself coffee but was too nervous to eat. At 8:15 she slipped out her back door and positioned herself behind the large oak tree in her front yard. From here she had a clear view of her front porch but would be hidden from anyone approaching. The minutes crawled by. 8:30, 8:40, 8:45. Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her hands were shaking. 8:47. A car pulled up to the curb. An old blue sedan that Margaret didn't recognize. The driver's side door opened and Margaret leaned forward, straining to see. A woman stepped out. She looked to be in her late 30s or early 40s with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater. She walked around to the passenger side and pulled out a bouquet of flowers. Margaret frowned. She didn't recognize this woman at all. Who was she? The woman walked up the path to Margaret's front door, moving quickly like she'd done this hundreds of times before. She placed the flowers gently on the doormat, then turned to leave. But instead of going back to her car, she paused. She stood there looking at the front door for a long moment. Then she wiped her eyes. She was crying. Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. She stepped out from behind the tree. "Excuse me," she called out. The woman spun around, her face pale with shock. Her eyes went wide and for a moment she looked like she might run. "Please don't go," Margaret said, walking toward her. "I just want to know who you are. Why you've been doing this." The woman stood frozen, her hand over her mouth. Tears were streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I should have stopped years ago, but I couldn't. I just couldn't." Margaret was confused. "Why are you apologizing? Please just tell me who you are." The woman took a shaky breath. "My name is Rachel Coleman, and I owe you more than I could ever repay." Margaret shook her head. "I don't understand. Do I know you?" "No," Rachel said quietly. "But you knew my son. 22 years ago your husband operated on him. Danny Coleman. He was 8 years old and he had a brain tumor." Margaret felt the world tilt slightly. Thomas had performed hundreds of surgeries over his career. She couldn't possibly remember them all. But Rachel continued. "The tumor was aggressive. Every other doctor we saw said there was nothing they could do. That we should take Danny home and make him comfortable. That we had maybe 6 months. But your husband, Dr. Hayes, he said he would try. He said he'd never give up on a child." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. That sounded exactly like Thomas. "The surgery took 14 hours," Rachel said, her voice breaking. 14 hours and your husband saved my son's life. Danny is 30 years old now, Mrs. Hayes. He's married. He has a daughter. He's an engineer. He has a whole life because of your husband." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. Rachel wiped her tears. "When I heard that Dr. Hayes had passed away, I wanted to go to the funeral. I wanted to thank him one more time. But I couldn't work up the courage. I was too late. So I started sending flowers. Every week. Because every week for the past 22 years I've woken up grateful that my son is alive. Every single week I think about what your husband gave us." Margaret was openly crying now. She reached out and pulled Rachel into a hug. They stood there on the front lawn, two women connected by an act of love from years ago, holding each other and crying. After a long moment they pulled apart. Rachel smiled through her tears. "I should have told you years ago," she said. "I'm sorry for the mystery." "No," Margaret said firmly. "Don't apologize. This has been the most beautiful gift. You have no idea how much these flowers have meant to me. How much they've helped me through the grief." Rachel nodded. "Your husband was an amazing man." "He was," Margaret agreed. "But so are you. 7 years, Rachel. You never missed a single week." "I never wanted you to feel alone," Rachel said simply. "Dr. Hayes saved my family. The least I could do was make sure his wife knew someone was thinking of her." They talked for another hour standing in Margaret's front yard. Rachel told her about Danny, about his wife Emily, about their 2-year-old daughter Grace. She showed Margaret photos on her phone, and Margaret felt her heart swell with joy at seeing this young man healthy and happy with his whole life ahead of him. "Would you like to meet him?" Rachel asked tentatively. "Danny has wanted to thank you for years. We just never knew how to reach out." "I would love that," Margaret said. "I would absolutely love that." They exchanged phone numbers and made plans for dinner the following weekend. After Rachel left, Margaret went back inside and sat at her kitchen table looking at the flowers with new eyes. These weren't just flowers. They were proof that Thomas's life had mattered. That the countless hours he'd spent in surgery, the nights he'd missed dinner, the weekends he'd worked instead of resting had all meant something. She picked up the phone and called Sarah. When her daughter answered, Margaret was smiling through tears. "Honey," she said, "I found out who's been sending the flowers. And you're not going to believe it." The following Saturday, Margaret dressed carefully in her nicest dress. She was more nervous than she'd been in years. Sarah had driven up from Boston to be there for this meeting. They were going to meet Rachel and Danny and his family at a restaurant downtown. When they arrived, Rachel was already there with a tall young man who had kind eyes and a warm smile. He stood up as Margaret approached, and she could see the emotion on his face. "Mrs. Hayes," Danny said, his voice thick. "I don't even know where to begin." Margaret took his hands in hers. "You don't have to say anything," she told him. "Just let me look at you." She studied his face, seeing the faint scar along his hairline where Thomas would have operated. This man was alive because of her husband. This man had a wife and a daughter because Thomas had refused to give up. Danny introduced his wife Emily and their little girl Grace, who was shy and hid behind her father's legs. Margaret knelt down to Grace's level. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly. "I'm Margaret." Grace peeked out and smiled. "You knew my grandpa, Danny's doctor," she said in a small voice. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes again. "I did, honey. He was my husband. And he would have loved knowing about you." They had dinner together, and it was one of the most beautiful evenings of Margaret's life. Danny told her about his childhood after the surgery, about the years of recovery and rehabilitation. He told her about the moment he decided to become an engineer because he wanted to build things that would last, because he'd been given a second chance at life. Sarah and Emily hit it off immediately, talking about their children and sharing photos. Rachel sat next to Margaret and at one point reached over and squeezed her hand. "Thank you," Rachel whispered. "Thank you for sharing him with us all those years ago." Margaret shook her head. "Thank you," she said, "for reminding me why Thomas did what he did. For keeping his memory alive." As the evening wound down, Danny pulled out an envelope. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I've been writing you a letter for 7 years. I just never had the courage to send it. But I want you to have it now." Margaret took the envelope with trembling hands. She opened it carefully and pulled out several pages of neat handwriting. She began to read. The letter detailed everything. Danny's memories of being sick. His fear. The moment he woke up after surgery and his parents were crying with joy because Dr. Hayes had saved him. The years that followed. Learning to walk again, learning to read again, rebuilding his life. Every milestone. Every achievement. Every moment of joy. And then the letter talked about Thomas. About how Danny had never forgotten the surgeon who refused to give up on him. About how he'd followed Thomas's career from afar, reading about his work, his research, his dedication to pediatric neurosurgery. About how when Danny got married, he'd wanted to invite Dr. Hayes but didn't want to seem strange. About how when Danny heard that Thomas had died, he'd cried like he'd lost his own father. Margaret read through, tears streaming down her face. When she finished, she carefully folded the letter and held it to her chest. "This is the most precious thing anyone has ever given me," she said. "Thank you, Danny. Thank you so much." They said their goodbyes with promises to stay in touch. Margaret and Sarah drove home in comfortable silence. When they pulled up to Margaret's house, Sarah turned to her mother. "Dad would be so proud," she said quietly. Margaret nodded. "He would be. And I'm grateful I got to see it." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed thinking about the incredible chain of events. Thomas saving Danny. Danny growing up and having a family. Rachel sending flowers for 7 years. The mystery finally solved. But there was something else nagging at her. Something Rachel had said during dinner. She'd mentioned that sending the flowers every week had become part of her routine. That she'd wake up on Sunday mornings and think about what kind of flowers to choose. That it had become her way of staying connected to the miracle that had saved her son. Margaret sat up in bed suddenly. She understood now. The flowers weren't just about gratitude. They were about connection. About making sure that Thomas's legacy lived on. About refusing to let his sacrifice be forgotten. And Margaret realized something profound. For 7 years she'd been the recipient of an extraordinary act of love. But now it was her turn. She picked up her phone and texted Rachel even though it was late. "Are you awake?" A moment later Rachel replied, "Yes, is everything okay?" Margaret typed quickly, "I have an idea. Can we meet for coffee this week?" They met at a small cafe near Margaret's house. Margaret brought a folder with her and placed it on the table between them. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you've done for me these past 7 years. About why you did it. And I think I understand now. You wanted to honor Thomas's memory. You wanted to make sure his work wasn't forgotten." Rachel nodded slowly. "That's exactly right." Margaret opened the folder. "I want to do something," she said. "I want to start a foundation in Thomas's name. A scholarship fund for medical students who want to go into pediatric surgery. Students who have the same dedication and compassion that Thomas had." Rachel's eyes widened. "Mrs. Hayes, that's incredible." Margaret smiled. "And I want you to help me. You and Danny. I want this to be something we do together. Because this isn't just about Thomas. It's about all the lives he touched. All the families like yours." Over the next 6 months, Margaret, Rachel, and Danny worked tirelessly to establish the Dr. Thomas Hayes Memorial Foundation. Sarah helped with the legal paperwork. Michael, who worked in finance, helped set up the fund structure. Emily designed the website. They reached out to Thomas's former colleagues at the hospital. To patients he'd saved over the years. To families who wanted to give back. The response was overwhelming. Story after story came in about Thomas. About his skill, his kindness, his refusal to give up even in the most hopeless cases. By the end of the year they had raised over $500,000. Enough to fund 2 full scholarships for medical students. The first scholarships would be awarded the following spring. On the 1-year anniversary of Margaret learning the truth about the flowers, she stood in front of a small gathering at the hospital where Thomas had worked. Rachel and Danny were there. Sarah and Michael. Emily holding Grace. Former colleagues. Former patients. All gathered to celebrate the launch of the foundation. Margaret stepped up to the microphone, her voice strong and clear. "My husband Thomas devoted his life to saving children," she began. "He believed that every child deserved a chance at life. That no case was ever truly hopeless. He worked long hours. He missed birthdays and anniversaries. He sacrificed so much. And for a long time after he died, I wondered if it had all been worth it." She paused, looking at Danny. "But then I learned about a young man named Danny Coleman. A boy who was given 6 months to live but who is now a husband and father because my husband refused to give up. And I learned about Danny's mother Rachel, who spent 7 years making sure I knew I wasn't alone. Who turned her gratitude into action." Margaret's voice grew stronger. "This foundation is Thomas's legacy. But it's also a promise. A promise that his work will continue. That other children will be saved. That other families will be given the gift of time together. And it's all because one woman refused to let an act of kindness be forgotten." The audience applauded. Margaret stepped down from the podium and Rachel embraced her. Through tears Rachel whispered, "Thank you for letting me be part of this." "No," Margaret said firmly. "Thank you for reminding me what love looks like." The scholarships were awarded that spring to 2 exceptional medical students who had both overcome incredible obstacles to pursue medicine. One was a young woman who had survived cancer as a child and wanted to become a pediatric oncologist. The other was a man who had grown up in foster care and wanted to give back to vulnerable children. At the award ceremony, both students spoke movingly about what the scholarship meant to them. Margaret sat in the audience feeling Thomas's presence beside her. She knew he would be proud. Not just of the foundation but of how it had come to be. How one act of surgical skill 22 years ago had rippled forward through time, creating waves of love and connection. After the ceremony, Margaret, Danny, and Rachel stood together looking at a plaque that had been hung in the hospital lobby. It read, "The Dr. Thomas Hayes Memorial Foundation, believing every child deserves a chance." "Do you think he knows?" Rachel asked quietly. Margaret smiled. "I think he does. And I think he's grateful that you never gave up on reminding me why his work mattered." Danny put his arm around his mother. "You gave Mrs. Hayes flowers for 7 years, Mom. But you gave our whole family something so much bigger. You gave us a way to say thank you." As they walked out of the hospital together, Margaret felt lighter than she had in years. The grief was still there, it would always be there, but it was softer now, transformed into something purposeful and beautiful. That Sunday morning, Margaret woke early. At 8:47 she went to her front door and opened it. There, sitting on her doormat, was a bouquet of sunflowers, bright and cheerful in the morning light. But this time there was a card. Margaret picked it up and read, "For everything you've given back. For honoring him. For honoring us all. With love, Rachel and Danny." Margaret brought the flowers inside and placed them in Thomas's crystal vase. The morning light caught the facets, casting rainbows across her kitchen table. She stood there for a long moment, breathing in the scent of the flowers and feeling grateful. Grateful for Thomas. Grateful for Rachel. Grateful for Danny and his family. Grateful for 7 years of anonymous flowers that had kept her company through the darkest time of her life. And grateful for the mystery that had led her here to this moment of purpose and connection. She picked up her phone and called Rachel. "The flowers are beautiful," she said when Rachel answered. Rachel laughed softly. "I couldn't stop completely. It's become too much of a tradition." "I'm glad," Margaret said. "But Rachel, I was thinking, what if next Sunday you don't just leave them on the doorstep? What if you come in for coffee?" There was a pause, then Rachel's voice came through, warm and full of emotion. "I would love that, Mrs. Hayes." "Please," Margaret said. "Call me Margaret. After 7 years of flowers, I think we can use first names." They both laughed and made plans for Sunday morning. Margaret hung up and looked around her kitchen. For 7 years she had been alone with her grief and her mystery flowers. But now her life was full again. Full of purpose. Full of connection. Full of a family she never knew she had. She walked over to the window and looked out at the quiet street of Maple Grove. The sun was fully up now, casting golden light across the neighborhood. Margaret smiled. Thomas had saved Danny's life 22 years ago. Rachel had saved hers with 7 years of flowers. And now together they were saving the future by giving other young doctors the chance to carry on Thomas's legacy. It was the most perfect circle of love and gratitude Margaret could have imagined. And it had all started with anonymous flowers and a mystery that took 7 years to solve. 7 years of flowers. 7 years of wondering. 7 years of someone caring enough to never forget. When she finally learned who sent them, she couldn't believe it. But now she understood. Love doesn't end. It transforms. It grows. It creates new connections, new purposes, new reasons to wake up on Sunday mornings and feel grateful to be alive. Margaret touched the petals of the sunflowers gently. "Thank you, Thomas," she whispered. "Thank you for saving Danny. Thank you for teaching me what it means to never give up. And thank you for leading me to this beautiful, unexpected family." Outside, the sun continued to rise. Inside, Margaret's heart felt full. The mystery was solved, but the story was just beginning. And every Sunday morning for the rest of her life, Margaret would wake up grateful for flowers, for second chances, and for the beautiful, unpredictable ways that love finds its way back to us when we need it most.